Yes, we can. Good morning or good afternoon, rather.
Good morning.
Can
Good
you hear
afternoon.
us?
Yeah, I guess it is good afternoon.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Well, hello and welcome to our Juneteenth celebration. Thank you for joining us for this very important discussion. This year's theme is Reclaiming History, Celebrating Truth. And today we have an amazing guest that we cannot wait to introduce, as he is known for speaking truth to power. So this will be a session that you wouldn't want to miss. So thank you again for joining us. Please note that we will offer a special Q&A session from 1 to 1:30 with our speaker. In addition, feel free to post your questions to the chat, and members of our committee will keep their eyes out for those questions. We are also requesting that you take a moment to complete the evaluation at the end of today's session, and we'll make sure to share the link in the chat. I am Rhonda Davis, our Justice Involved Family Specialist in the Human Development and Relationships Institute, and I also have the pleasure of serving as the AABERG co-chair. So on behalf of AABERG, I want to welcome you again to today's session. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on this week in Black history. On June 16, 1970, Kenneth Gibson was elected as the 36th mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and became the first African-American mayor of a major Eastern U.S. city. He served as mayor from 1970 to 1986, and he was an American politician of the Democratic Party. In 1976, Gibson became the first African-American president of the United States Conference of Mayors. Please visit AABERG's SharePoint site as well as our calendar of events to learn more. Thank you again for sharing your lunch hour with the African American Black Employee Resource Group, more affectionately known as AABERG. The AABERG's purpose is to serve as a resource for and foster current and future African American colleagues' success by sponsoring programming, providing collegial support, encouraging belonging, and raising a collective voice related to issues that impact employees' abilities to thrive personally and professionally. Again, we would love your feedback and will provide a link to our survey in the chat as we close out this session. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge members of our committee. Danielle Hairston Green serves as our committee chair. Again, I'm Rhonda Davis, our co-chair. Quintella Perry is our secretary. Cheryl Isabel is the chair of professional development. Catherine Borg-Smott is our treasurer. James Bowling and Eva Terry serve as our co-chairs of membership and retention, and Carla Williams is the chair of marketing and media. Today, I'd also like to take a moment just to share community guidelines to ensure a respectful and enjoyable experience for everyone. These guidelines will be shared in the chat, so please take a moment to review them in full detail. But just know that this is a safe space for expression, inclusive participation, respectful engagement, growth and exploration. We ask that all members of this community use appropriate language and report any issues that may be encountered during this time. At this time, I would like to take a moment to introduce our speaker, and I'm going to do this quickly because I want to make certain that he gets all of his time with us. We have been invited to the cookout today. I'm just going to say that, and Michael knows what that means. Michael Harriot is a writer who writes things. When CNN wanted to know the origin of the phrase woke, they called Michael Harriot. When MSNBC needed someone to explain critical race theory, they called Michael Harriot. When Black Twitter was asked to choose one name that embodied its collective ethos, Michael Harriot was the runway answer. And if you're wondering what 5 things you need to know on Juneteenth, simply call the Household of Faith's annual Juneteenth Bazaar 6-time undefeated biblical pursuit champion. You guessed it, Michael Harriot. Michael Harriot is a journalist, author, and cultural critic who has been hailed as one of the most eloquent writers in America. His acerbic wit, biting commentary, and investigative reporting have influenced everything from presidential politics to pop culture. As the originator of the phrase "invited to the cookout," His social media posts contextualizing history are shared by millions, while his award-winning journalism has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Your Television, and his mother's refrigerator. Harriot is the author of the book Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. And I'm just gonna say this is the first day that I feel very comfortable saying the title of that book. Thank you very much. I should have felt more comfortable in other spaces, but I'm just telling my truth. And currently serves as a columnist for The Guardian and thegrio.com, where he covers the intersection of race, politics, and media, and animal attacks, but mostly the politics and race stuff. Without further ado, I move out of the way and present to you Mr. Michael Harriot.
Thank you, Rhonda, and thank you guys for inviting me on Juneteenth. On this holiday, I've been, as Rhonda mentioned, I wrote a piece that came out today about, I grew up celebrating Juneteenth, and I thought my mom invented Juneteenth because every year my church would have this Juneteenth bazaar, and we'd like have kickball games, all the bazaar stuff, three-legged race, bobbing for apples. And my church would also have it was basically Bible Jeopardy, but they call it Biblical Pursuit instead of Trivial Pursuit, which the name was so bad, I'm sure my mom came up with that name too. So I thought she was really bad at coming up with names. And so like the organization that the bazaar was fundraising for was the Holy Young People's Union, which is a terrible acronym because it could have been the Holy Young Union of People, and high up was right there, right? Like it was right there. So I grew up like celebrating Juneteenth all my life. And, it was only later that I found out that like most people didn't know what Juneteenth was. I was homeschooled for most of my life until I was in the fifth grade, and then I was skipped to the seventh grade. So, I just thought Juneteenth was something that everyone knew, and it wasn't until recently when they started talking about making Juneteenth a federal holiday that I realized, oh, most people didn't know what Juneteenth was. And I remember a few years ago, so I am also a poet, and another poet, a guy named Kirk Hardesty, came up to me, and he had just learned about Juneteenth. This was maybe 10, 15 years ago. And he says, he was like, well, why isn't that Independence Day instead of July 4th? And I was like, I don't know, man, beats me. But it gets to the point that we're going to talk about today, which is reclaiming history, right? So first we have to ask ourselves, what is history, right? For some of us, history is what we learned in school, a collection of dates and names and timelines and the stuff we read in our social studies book, right? But to me, what history is a collection of stories. And the collection of stories in any story, right? Whether it's history or, literature, it's all dependent on who tells it, right? I imagine that in the Joker story, he is the hero and Batman is the villain. You think about it, right? Like Batman doesn't have police training. He just goes around beating up people, right? And so in a lot of people's story, Batman is probably the villain. But in the way we tell the story and the way we know the story and the way everyone knows the story, he's a superhero. Even though he has no superpowers, everybody agrees that Batman is a superhero, and his superhero is either anger, because he's just still mad about what happened to his parents, which I can understand, or having a lot of money. But, I bring that up just to illustrate that it's just a story, and the way you interpret it is depending on who tells it. Like we see the story essentially through the eyes of Batman, right? Through the guys who wrote the comic books, who were telling us a superhero story. And American history is the same way, right? So in American history, we have superheroes, the founding fathers, right? So we don't teach that, most of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence owned human beings, right? We don't teach that because that would lessen their superpower was democracy, right? Was these great thinkers of the Enlightenment era. And so if we told the story through the eyes of the people they owned, it would be a different story. I remember a few years ago, I was commissioned to write a piece on the plantation tourism industry in South Carolina. So we went to this place called Magnolia Plantation. Magnolia Plantation was owned by a family, and at no time in what they call the big house did no more than 5 people ever live there. And at every point during their period of owning that piece of property, and one of the things I say in my book is I believe it's one of the most important pieces of property in the history of this country. It sits at the nexus of the Stono River, the Atlantic Ocean. So, it is the origin story for so much of our history. But at every point during the time that this family owned it, more than 100 slaves lived there, enslaved people. And when you go there, you hear the story of the 5 people and not the 100 people, and they call that history, right? And it's not really history. It's not accurate history. Most of what we learn is not accurate history because we learn it through the eyes of the superheroes, right? And the same is true with American history, and especially the history of Black Americans, right? So before we even get to Juneteenth, we have to understand the history, a little bit of the history. It's impossible to know all of the history, but we have to understand a little bit of the history of what necessitated Juneteenth, right? So we call it slavery, and I know everyone here has heard someone say, well, slavery existed in every society in the planet throughout history, which, if you flatten the term to slavery, it is true, some form of slavery. But you have to ask yourself, what is slavery, right? Is a forced marriage slavery, right? Is peonage slavery? Is indentured servitude slavery? Is forcing somebody to serve in the military for a number of years slavery, right? All of that takes away freedom. But when we talk about slavery in America, that's why I like to specify that we're talking about a race-based human trafficking system that reduces human beings to chattel, right? So in 1739, a literate enslaved man named Emmy in South Carolina woke up one morning, and he and about a dozen other enslaved people started their plan, and their plan was to go to make it to Spanish Florida. And their only directive was, if we see white people, we're going to kill them. Now, they really didn't do that because there were some people who they spared. Said, this guy is nice. This guy is against owning human beings. So they spared him. And so, but because of that, that's what they call the Stono Rebellion, which happened in South Carolina. At the end of that, at the end of their trek, at the end of that first day, they stopped beside the Stono River. And it just so happened they ran into a man named William Bull. Well, William Bull was at the time the lieutenant governor of South Carolina. He ran away on his horse, came back with the militia, and they put down the Stono Rebellion. Well, the people of South Carolina came and wrote the Negro Act of 1740 the next year. And the Negro Act of 1740 is essentially what defined slavery for the rest of the term. This was before there was an America, right? So the Negro Act of 1740, for instance, was the first American, what we call American law, but it was a colonial law that banned enslaved people from reading and writing, defined what they could wear. They couldn't gather in groups of 3 or more. So that Stono rebellion enacted the Negro Act of 1740, and every state that enslaved people kind of adopted parts or the whole of the Negro Act of 1740. That's why almost every enslaved state banned reading and writing, right? That's why the slave codes, banned slaves from gathering in groups of people. That's what precipitated one of the first official colonial slave catchers. But one of the interesting things about the Negro Act of 1740 that, is almost never discussed is that it wasn't a criminal code, right? So if an enslaved person was caught reading or writing, they weren't like put in jail or subject to a trial. And that's because South Carolina did a very specific thing. They classified the Negro Act of 1740 as property law, as civil law, not criminal law. It was not a criminal code, right? So all of those other states or those other colonies at the time, and then eventually when they became states, their Supreme Court said, well, those people who are enslaved are not citizens. And so these versions of the Negro Act of 1740 are legitimate because this law defines their property, not human beings that are citizens of the United States. So that Negro Act of 1740, again, created kind of how human bondage, race-based servitude was defined. And again, because there was no like tribunal if you got caught running away, it was a property law. So because there was no American law that enforced slavery until the Constitution, and we'll get to that, but because these were not criminal codes, the way slavery was enforced was through violence or the threat of violence. There is no other way, right? And specifically, like in South Carolina, right? South Carolina, for most of its existence until the 1946, since South Carolina was majority Black, right? In that place where that plantation stood, there were 1,500 people on Johns Island. 200 of them were white. The rest of them were enslaved. You cannot enact a code of conduct that governed the brutality that, over 1,000 people, if not for violence. I mean, you couldn't go to the justice of the peace and plead your case, right? It was just violence. And one of the ways they did it was after they became an official colony, they created what they called a sugar house, a municipal supported place where if your enslaved people acted up, you could send them to the state or to the city and they would punish them, right? They would beat them, they would do it what they say, we won't harm your property, right? Again, these were civil laws. And the reason we have to understand this is because when we're talking about slavery and when we're talking about that first Juneteenth, we're going to have to understand the backstory, not just we know the heroes side of the story, right? We know George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the division between the North and the South. But if you're looking at the story through the perspective of the enslaved people, of the Black people, of 4 million people in the United States, right? This was their perspective. It was just two groups of people fighting, and they wanted to be free. That was the only concern of the enslaved people. So one of the premises that I always say is that the Civil War, we have to remember, was not fought to free the slaves, right? The end of human bondage was a consequence of the Civil War, right? It was not fought to free the slaves. The South fought to keep slavery, and the North fought to keep the Union together, right? To stop the Union from being divided. So and it's not my opinion, Abraham Lincoln said it himself. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could save it by freeing none of the slaves, I would. What I do is not about slavery. It is about saving the Union, right? And I think he would know, right? So we have to understand this to get to Juneteenth. We also have to understand that my belief and the belief of a lot of Black scholars, not the guys who wrote the superhero version of the story, but guys like W.E.B. Du Bois, he called it the general strike. Other black scholars gave it other names, but essentially what they're saying is that America did not free the slaves. The slaves freed themselves, right? In essence, what the Civil War was the largest slave revolt in history, right? More slaves ran away during the Civil War. I know we talk about the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad was kind of a thing that, like white historians, because they create history, they place a lot of importance on, but it's always interesting to me, like even during the period that the Underground Railroad was active, most slaves that escaped did not go to the Underground Railroad, right? Most of the escaped slaves did not even go to like free states, right? Like you got to have a map and know where the borders are and know how to read to know about free states versus slave states if you know the perspective of the Black people. Now, to the historians, they found out about the Underground Railroad, and we always point that out. So, so during the Civil War, all of these enslaved people were escaping. The first, coincidentally, and maybe not coincidentally, maybe it's divine providence, right? The first, really documented escape were three people in Point Comfort, Virginia, which is literally where the Jamestown people landed and where those first enslaved people landed, right? And so those three guys escaped, and because technically the South had seceded, they weren't part of the United States, and by the conventions of war, you can't just take people's property when you're at war. It controverts the Declaration and the accepted principles of warfare. So when those three enslaved people escaped, the Union Army had to figure out what to do with them. So what they did is, right, they were property, remember? Way back in 1740, they determined that they were property. So all of those escaped slaves, over 100,000 of them, they were declared contraband. That was the official type. That was the official label of an escaped enslaved person who freed themselves. Contraband. And remember that during slavery, these people, we, again, because of who writes history, we think of these people as laborers, farm laborers working on plantations. And that was not always the case, right? Merchants, many of the merchants owned slaves, and they were literate, even though even in states where it was against the law, there were literate enslaved people who ran the stores, did the accounting, and remember the South had a very high, in some states as many as 20%, 25% of the white population was illiterate. We estimate about 10% of enslaved people were literate, but remember, it was against the rules to read, so I don't know how they came up with those estimates. Nobody really knows how. The best guess is somebody just guessed one time. But my point is that these people weren't laborers. They were intelligent. We think about their labor being stolen, but not the intellectual theft. On that same plantation visit that I did, covering plantation tourism, when I visited that plantation, it was an old rice plantation, again, right at the nexus of the Stono River. And one of the visitors asked, well, there was like a month ago, there was a storm that they called 100-year flood. I'm from South Carolina. They had what they call 100-year flood. And the visitor asked, well, how did this plantation survive this recent 100 years flood in 2015? And the tour guide said, well, the dams and the levees that the enslaved people built to flood the rice fields and then let them back out, they still work 300 years later. And the point is that these people were not laborers, they were engineers. Like, there was no rice culture in Europe. Like, when they built this first cash crop and first edible cash crop in America, rice. So these people, not just their labor was stolen, but their intellectual property, right? Like the American form of blacksmithing is just an African form of metallurgy that was brought from Africa, right? Many of the things that we know and say is as American is just the intellectual property that the enslaved people brought here. Remember, the first Jamestown settlers, almost all but 9 starved to death, all but 9. Right? Until those Africans arrived, they didn't know how to plant things. They didn't know how to grow things. They were just investors. Which brings us to June 18th, 1865. And I say 18th because I want to start the day before. So the day before the first Juneteenth, remember that slavery still existed. It would still exist the day after Juneteenth in America, right? Delaware and Kentucky and some of those border states didn't end slavery until December of 1865 when the 13th Amendment was ratified. But again, Juneteenth is just an arbitrary day. We choose what we commemorate because the Declaration of Independence wasn't signed or written on July 4th. We chose that date. If you look in, John Adams' paper, what does he say? He said this day will be celebrated in perpetuity, but the date that he was talking about was July 2nd, right? So we just choose arbitrary dates. We have to understand that. But on June 18th, the people, the enslaved people in Texas were just not people who were enslaved on Texas plantations, because as the Civil War progressed, Texas was kind of the last frontier, the last front of that war. So there were Southerners who moved to Texas to avoid having their property being freed. And so when General Order Number 3 was read in Galveston on the 19th, they did not free the enslaved people. Again, right here, we have to stop and consider the meaning of freedom, because there is the freedom that, African Americans, that Black people, enslaved people thought about, right? Which was not enslaved, right? And that's what they considered being free, not enslaved, right? They didn't think about equal citizenship. They didn't, if their lives wasn't ruled by violence or the threat of violence, they considered that free. Not being enslaved was their definition of free. But to Americans, that wasn't free, right? Like the Jim Crow laws that existed even before the Civil War, right? The segregation and the segregated railroad cars that existed in the North, the segregated schools that existed in the North, that existed before the Civil War. And those white people would never be subjected to that because they would consider that not being free. That's why we created America, right? Because they said the heroes, the superheroes in the origin story said, hey, the Stamp Act and high taxes on tea, that ain't free, right? They weren't even concerned about slavery, right? To the white people, their definition of freedom was kind of cultivated during the period of the Enlightenment, and especially with John Locke. And John Locke said, freedom is the natural state of man, right? So you cannot give someone freedom. It's the natural state. It's the state that you were born with. But you, man, or societies or countries can take away freedom, right? And the only thing that a country can do is remove the barriers that stop people from being free. Well, imagine if you were in jail and you were convicted of a crime that you didn't commit, and you spent 20 years in prison, and then one day you got a call from the warden, and the warden says, your conviction has been overturned. You're free. But you can't leave the prison. You still got to work in the prison kitchen every day, but you're free now, right? Your status has changed legally, right? You don't have a conviction on your record, but you can't leave the prison. You got to stay here. You got to work for these prison wages. Well, that is exactly what happened on June 19th, 1865. Remember, in General Order Number 3, it didn't just say, like, y'all can do whatever you want to. It specifically said the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So we said that they were free, but not really, right? They had to stay in the prison and work in the kitchen. Right? Is that free? That is the question. Well, there is no group of white people in the history of America that would consider that freedom, right? That is more bondage than the reasons that precipitated us starting a revolution to free ourselves from him, right? If the King George would have declared every American had to work at a specific job, we would have started a revolt earlier, right? So I'm bringing that up to start us to thinking about the perspectives of freedom and how history defines it, right? Like, history gives us this definition of slavery that we accept, even though, it is an inadequate way to reference this uniquely American institution, right? That was race-based, constitutionally enforced, and it lasted for centuries. And the same is true with freedom, right? Who was free on June 19th, 1865? Well, we know the freedmen weren't, right? The people who had been enslaved, they had a new status, but that status was still not free. First of all, they weren't citizens, right? It wouldn't be until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment kind of gave them the slate of equal rights that we consider, free. And so they weren't citizens. They weren't technically Americans. And the same is true not just for the enslaved people, but for all of the Black people, right? Even the Black people in the North, even the Black people who weren't enslaved, right? In even the most liberal states, right? They couldn't attend schools, right? New York took away African Americans' voting rights right before the Civil War, right? We think of the South as being the racist place, but it was America, right? It's just that institution was unique to the South and then Delaware and a few other states. But again, all of that is contingent on whose story, whose version of history you're reading. So on June 19th, 1865, the status of these peoples changed. Now, the interesting part is why. So long before, in 1862, General David Hunter had been sent to, command the Union forces in South Carolina, Georgia, parts of Florida. And, he was from the North. So he didn't know anything about the South and South Carolina, but he found someone who did. He found a scout who came with him. The scout was African American. And so the white soldiers said, hey, we don't want to work with someone who isn't even a commissioned Army officer. So the scout said, okay, I'll work for free. And it was a woman, and she started making pies. Her name was Harriet Tubman. And, the South was holding their own at the beginning. And Harriet Tubman gave David Hunter an idea. She said, why don't we just free the slaves? They know the terrain better than the white people. They know the crops. And this is the important point. If we free them, if we just, when we conquer these lands, say, you don't have to stay here. We don't have to break their chains. We don't have to give them anything. If we say, just do whatever you want, then that will take away so much material wealth from the South that the Southern Empire will collapse. And that's what happened, right? David Hunter wrote this order, and these slaves started freeing themselves. Well, when Abraham Lincoln got wind of it, he was furious, and he rescinded Hunter's general order, but he kept it. And that's what formed the basis. This order, precipitated by Harriet Tubman, formed the basis of what we know as the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, America did not free the slaves freed themselves. And by freeing themselves, by doing what W.B. Du Bois called the general strike, taking away not just the labor, but that intellectual property, by taking, some of these mortgages and these home loans were secured through the bodies of enslaved people. By taking away that material wealth, it crippled the Southern economy, and that's partly why the South lost the Civil War. Again, America did not free the slaves. If you look at the version of the story of the people, of the Black people, the people in the South, the slaves freed themselves, right? So on June 19th, 1865, it was technically a victory for all of these Black people, the ones who fought in the Union Army, the ones who just by freeing themselves crippled the Southern economy, just by taking away that material wealth. And what happened after that, what happened next is interesting because it kind of is the origin point of the story of America as we know it today. First of all, remember, Mississippi, South Carolina, and some of those other states were majority Black. So in 1868, right, remember these states had to rewrite their constitution, write a whole new constitution because they weren't part of America. To be admitted into the Union, they had to submit a constitution. Well, in 1868, South Carolina, remember a majority Black state, had a constitutional convention. So of course, because those Black people were now able to vote, the constitutional delegation was majority Black. They gathered in Charleston, South Carolina. And on the first day, they basically had to come up with the ideas that was going to create this new society. And the interesting thing, and this is an important point we have to remember about history, in Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana, it's more complex because there was a white minority, but that's including free people of color, right? But in these states, they wrote these constitutions that were very progressive. Universal male suffrage. They levied taxes that would help society. But in South Carolina, that South Carolina constitutional delegation, just by proxy of being the first, that first day they said, well, the first thing we got to do is we got to create a way to educate the Black people. That was what they always wanted. And so they created this system of publicly funded schools. Now, it wasn't new. America, there were states that had publicly funded schools before, right? Even in Massachusetts, Massachusetts had a law that guaranteed public education, but not equal. And sometimes they had what they call driving outs, where they would just drive out the African-American population out of some cities. And Massachusetts also was a piece of legislation. It wasn't in their constitution. What South Carolina created was the first constitutionally mandated, publicly funded, free education system for all people. What we know as the American education system did not exist before Black people created it in 1868. And that's important to know when you hear, you know, people say, well, Black people would just care about education, you know, it seems like people forget, like not even long ago, my grandparents let my parents' generation be spat on by white people so they could attend an equal school, right? So there was never a moment in history where Black people didn't value education. Again, it was so important to Black people that every state that had slaves had to write a law saying, you gotta stop learning or we will kill you. And they still didn't stop it. And then the first act of all of these Black governing powers when we gained power was not to enact retribution on all of that violence that had been inflicted on Black people for centuries. It did not happen in mass anywhere in the country, which is an interesting thing, right? To think about, like when the way Black people are characterized as violence, when they had power in these majority Black states, there was no mass violence from the Black people. And the first thing that they created, their first acts was to create what we now call an American education system, not just to educate Black people, but to educate everyone, right? They did not do it. It was not race-based. It was not, based on the status of being free or not. They said everyone who is an American deserves an education. And that's what happened. And that's those things are the origin of that Ta-Nehisi Coates quote. We were 8 years in power. I'm sorry, my dog is wilding in the back. But that's the origin of that quote, right? Like when those majority Black states, specifically he was quoting a South Carolina senator, but when those majority Black states gained power after the Civil War until the white terrorist groups so-called redeemed the South, there was no widespread violence against whites. They were creating the kind of progressive society that we still fight for today, right? And that was the consequence of not giving Black people freedom, but allowing them to have some measure of self-determination. So we return to the original question, what is freedom then? Because, we hear about, the advocates who are against so-called affirmative action and DEI, and the biggest argument is that we want to create a society where everybody is equal, as like communism. But what their notion of freedom was the opportunity to build a measure of whatever you wanted based on how hard you work, your talents, your intelligence, and your ability. And so that's what freedom is, right? To most people, right? It's not the ability to, be higher than someone else. It's not the opposite of enslaved. It is the natural state. However hard I work, whatever my work ethic is, whatever talents I have, can I use them to advance and to advance future generations. Well, the interesting thing about that is when we think about that next period that came after June 19th, 1865, it was, call it Jim Crow, we call it, segregation, but what it really was, now that given these people, or these people that had enacted a measure of their own self-determination, it was really theft. When you think about it, right? Again, let's go back to South Carolina, where there was a majority Black state still in 1940. And in Somerton, South Carolina, there was a community that was 75% Black, was right on the edge of this reservoir that had been built right after the Great Depression with New Deal money. And because of that reservoir, there was this huge paper factory there. And that's important because the Black unemployment rate there was lower than the white unemployment rate. Almost everybody worked at the paper factory. And they had two schools. It was South Carolina's Constitution had been redeemed, and they had enacted constitutionally mandated segregation. So this town wanted a school bus because for their children to get to school every day, they had to cross this reservoir. And like once or twice every year, one of the Black kids drowned. Well, the 75% Black community bought a school bus. All the parents got together and bought a school bus. And that school bus broke down. So they went to the school superintendent, right? And said, hey, this school district has 32 school buses. Can we have one? And the superintendent said no. So they filed a lawsuit against the superintendent, Elliot. The first name on the lawsuit was the Briggs family, Harry and Eliza Briggs. So Briggs versus Elliot was the first of the 5 cases that became known as Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated schools. Now, the interesting thing about that is we think about segregation as unequal education, but what it really was, right, was all of those Black families who were employed were paying for the generational wealth of that minority of white families. They had 32 school buses because of the Black people, right? It was their tax dollars that funded that school district, right? And it wasn't just that they were funding it for the white kids, their wealth was being stolen from them, the generational wealth. And if you expand it further, again, in a majority Black state, South Carolina had 7 public colleges, only 1 Black public college, and that was not state supported. It was built, it was South Carolina State, which was built with federal dollars, right? So all of those Black people in South Carolina for generations, were funding that opportunity, that they were funding the thing that I talked about earlier, freedom. What is freedom? The opportunity to advance based on your talent, your ability, your work ethic. All of the white people had it, and they didn't just have it because they were Americans. Again, even after June 19th, 1865, they had it because the Black labor and the Black intellectual property was funding freedom for white Americans. And when we talk about, like, my family didn't own slaves, so I didn't benefit from slavery. Yeah, kind of. But just imagine, right? When you went to the store, why were the shirts so cheap? Because the cotton that was farmed to make those shirts was picked with free labor, right? Why were the roads you drove down maintained? Because they had slave labor, not just to maintain the roads, right? But they produced wealth for the people who paid taxes that benefited the entire society, right? So that labor and that intellectual property funded freedom that we know it. Again, the first white people that got here starved to death. And then came the Black people, and our labor and intellectual property funded freedom. What we know is freedom in America, right? Like the banks in the North, they were built with Black labor and Black intellectual property. Well, why do I say that? Well, there's a statistic that is always the most astounding one to me, is that at the eve of the Civil War, the value of the human property that was enslaved in America was worth more than all of the money in all of the banks in America, plus all of the manufacturing, plus all of the other GDP combined, right? Like the value of Black people was worth more, the Black property that was determined by that original 1740 law was worth more than everything else that all of the white people had created in the history of this country. That is the story that is not the superhero story, right? Right? That is why you have to reclaim history. Now, you can argue against it, right? Like there are arguments like, well, Thomas Jefferson wrote that thing, that Constitution and that Declaration of Independence, and that gave us a measure of freedom. There is an argument of that. But if you erase the value of the Black people from the story, if you erase that 1740 law from the story, if you erase all of that intellectual property and just make it big Black bucks picking cotton from the story, then you don't know the story. You're telling the story of the 5 people in the big house and not the 100 on the plantation that we call America. And that's why it's important to reclaim history. No one's saying that we got to villainize all the white people and valorize the Black people. But why we got to have a Batman and why we have to have a Joker? Why can't we say this is what happened? And you can choose your Batman and you can choose your Joker. But that's not how we learn history. That's not how it's still told today, right? Like they make the other side of the story, the true side of the story of the 100 people, they, in many states, make it illegal. I just finished, publishing a story about South Carolina. Well, they made AP African American Studies, they banned it from the state, right? And, a lot of outlets have reported on it, but all of this history that I've been telling you today, right, is based in South Carolina because 40% of enslaved people came through South Carolina. It was basically, it was called the slave capital of the New World. Well, not only did they ban AP African American Studies, but even before and now after, there isn't a single state accredited high school Black history course in the entire state of South Carolina. Right? So I think we do have to reclaim history, but I think we have to phrase it different because reclaiming history infers that there was a time when we learned and taught history and then somehow we lost it, or we lost claim to it, when actually we never told the story. We never told the story of 1740. We never told the story of the intellectual property. We never told the story of who created the American education system. We never told the story of who funded freedom for America. So we have to first claim history before we can reclaim it. And I think that's what we should think about on today, Juneteenth, and holidays like this, even July 4th. So I want to thank you guys for listening to me, and I want to thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for spending this amazing hour with us. You've given us a lot to chew on and consider. And on behalf of the AABERG, as well as our colleagues, friends, and partners of the Division of Extension, it's our hope that we can call upon you to continue engaging us in meaningful and necessary discussions of this nature. just a few pearls that I'd like to reshare is this idea that America didn't free slaves. Slaves freed themselves, which crippled the Southern economy. So this idea of remaining quiet while working for wages, that's something that I'll sit with, and that we must reconsider how we define history, the idea of slavery and freedom in an effort to rightly discover the truth of our existence. So thinking about whose perspectives our stories are being told. And then the idea of Black labor and Black intellectual property that funded freedom in America. And I'm sure others could share a lot more. As a reminder, Michael's full bio and a recording of today's session can be found only on our SharePoint site, so that we hope you'll continue to reflect upon what you've learned today, as well as share with others. Thank you to everyone who joined this live discussion, as well as thank you to those who will be taking the time to watch the recording of this phenomenal discussion. For those of you who will stay logged on to have a more intimate Q&A with Michael, please hold tight. And if there are, we do have a couple minutes during this live to, if there are any questions that have come up. I know there was a comment in the chat, and it says, Michael, it seems that DEI in its current form is also a form of a crafted superhero story. What are your thoughts on DEI? Also, when will you add your next podcast post?
So my thoughts on DEI is, like, when we talk about DEI or affirmative action or any of those policies that were corrective, like, we can't eliminate or can't forget why they existed in the first place, right? So, when you talk about, for instance, first of all, we have this misunderstanding of what DEI policies are, right? Like, there are no corporations in America who are hiring unqualified people just to help Black people. Like, there is no policy that, like, capitalism or companies or America ever adopted. Like, we just gonna help Black people by doing this, right? Like, it's a crazy notion in and of itself, right? And so I wrote about that, one of the origin stories of this whole backlash was Duke, right? Duke was supposedly had this DEI policy for its medical school. And they said, well, it's those unqualified people are going to kill patients. And, the other origin story was United Airlines. United Airlines had a DEI program. Well, the reason United Airlines and Duke created those programs was because, like, United Airlines couldn't find pilots, right? Like, it wasn't that they wanted Black pilots, they just wanted pilots, right? And because of the way that, you get qualified to be a pilot, it requires, kind of an affluent backstory. You have to have money to be a pilot. You could be a Navy jet pilot or whatever, but for a civilian to become a pilot, you got to kind of have some money. So what United said was, well, we know there's a group that might be good at being pilots or might want to be pilots if they had the resources. So we're going to provide the resources for this group just because we need pilots. We don't want Black pilots. We just need more pilots. And statistically, like, the average white person has the resources to achieve that goal. So we're going to target a group that is underrepresented, not just because we want the representation to be equal in the pilot industry or in the airline industry, but because we just need more pilots. And so it's only natural that we look in the place where the pilots aren't coming from and provide the resources and see if that works. And that's how DEI works, right? I remember when I was a junior in college, we used to have this mentorship program, and we mentored this class of kids, and one of the kids just, like, took on to us. He would just come and just hang out. He lived in the projects right down the street from where my frat brother and I lived in an apartment. So he would just come out and hang out every day. And he had his dad was a welder, so he knew how to weld. So he had the side hustle where he would just take old bikes, weld the frames together, and create these really tall bikes that kids like in the neighborhood loved to have. But to ride them, he had to create this system of pulleys and levers to weave the chains together. Well, my roommate was a engineering major. And every year, the engineering department has this race to create a solar powered car, not to see which car is the fastest, but to see how far it would go. And every iteration of the motor that group would come up with wouldn't work, right? It would go fast, but not far. And he says, well, like, why y'all keep creating a rotating motor? Why don't y'all just create something to push pedals and do the same thing I did with my bicycle? And he showed them how, and they won the race. Now, the reason I think that's important is because all of those students, they were not all white. My roommate was black, but they had all learned in the same engineering classes, in the same engineering department, at the same university. And because one student, not because he was poor, but because he had a different way of understanding engineering, a different background that he brought to the table, it made their product better. And that's how DEI works, right? If everybody from the same background works for a company, then they're all going to come up with the same solutions every time. And they're going to lose to a company that has more diverse solutions and more diverse ideas. And that's what DEI is about. Like, companies generally want to win. They want to make more money. They're not enacting policies just to help the African American community. They're trying to make money. And the backlash against DEI is because what many companies and many colleges are realizing is, oh, the people with the historic and the social and the political and the economic advantages, like, they kind of mediocre when they get on stage. And there's a group that don't have these advantages. Why don't we look to them and include them? Because we want to make our product or our school or our institution better. Imagine if the University of Wisconsin-Madison said, only the kids from the best schools um, could come here. Well, it's probably going to end up being white schools because white schools get more funding. And do you think those schools, those students at an all-white school are going to get an equal, diverse, well-rounded education versus a student with people who attended a school with people from all backgrounds? It's probably not going to happen, right? And so what those anti-DEI policies and anti-affirmative action policies do is reverts to the preference for mediocrity versus allowing colleges to search unmined areas for excellence.
You again. And I didn't see any other, sorry, multitasking, man, the chat. And actually, that is our time for our live session. Thank you all again for joining us. And for those that want to stay on, please hold tight because we'll have a more intimate Q&A with Mr. Harriot. So otherwise, have a wonderful afternoon, and